Why did the street feel wrong before the first shot was fired? Sloane Carter noticed it the way a doctor noticed a patient's breathing change by half a beat. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just the quiet absence of things that should have been there. Children, dogs, open windows. At 8 in the morning, a residential block in Fallujah should have sounded alive. Voices, metal gates creaking, radios behind thin walls. Instead, the street felt sealed, held in place like a lung refusing to exhale. Sloane adjusted the weight of the medical pack on her shoulders. 42 pounds of trauma gear, gauze, fluids, morphine, instruments. Enough supplies to keep several men alive long enough to reach a surgeon. She was 5'4", 118 pounds, and the only woman in the squad. 3 positions ahead of her, Corporal Declan Pewitt walked with the heavy confidence of a man who trusted his rifle more than anything else in the world. He had made it clear the day she arrived that he didn't understand why a corpsman, especially a female one, needed to walk inside a clearing patrol. "Doc patches people up," he had said during briefing. "She doesn't need to be kicking doors." Sergeant Garrett Voss hadn't argued. He had simply replied, "She goes where the squad goes." That had been the end of the conversation. But Sloane had felt the doubt hanging in the air ever since. Now she watched the empty street and felt something else. Danger. Her father used to say instinct wasn't magic. It was memory moving faster than thought. Frank Carter had been a combat medic before lung cancer stole the strength from his lungs. He had taught Sloane to read the world like a set of vital signs. Color, movement, silence. Right now the city felt like a patient whose pulse was about to crash. She stepped forward beside Sergeant Voss. "Something off," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. "Explain." No civilian activity, no animals, doors closed, windows covered. She paused. "It looks like everyone was warned." Voss slowed. The squad halted behind him. For a moment he studied the silent street stretching ahead. Then he exhaled slowly. "Stay sharp," he said. They moved again. Sloane returned to her position and rested her hands on the straps of her pack. Her mind began its quiet preparation. Not fear. Math. Who to treat first if contact happened. Who could survive long enough to wait. It was a cruel calculation. But it was the only one that saved lives. They were halfway down the second block when the world exploded. Gunfire ripped across the rooftops. Sharp. Coordinated. Planned. Rounds tore into the street from 3 directions at once. An ambush. Marines dove for cover behind vehicles and concrete walls. Sloane dropped instinctively, her mind already mapping injuries she hadn't even seen yet. Then someone screamed. Caleb Whitmore, 19 years old. She had checked his pulse that morning, 62 beats per minute under her fingers. Now his voice cut through the gunfire in raw pain. But another shape fell first. Warren Fitch, 31. Father of 2 daughters. The man who had shown her the drawing of a house with a yellow door just yesterday. He collapsed without a sound. Sloane froze for half a second. 2 patients. 1 medic. Her training spoke without emotion. A silent equation. The man who made no sound was already gone. The one still calling could still live. She ran. 50 meters of open street. Bullets snapped past her like angry insects. The first round slammed into her shoulder. Heat. Impact. Her arm went numb. She kept moving. Another shot struck her thigh. She stumbled, corrected her balance, and kept running. Whitmore lay curled around something. Not equipment. A child. A small Iraqi girl, maybe 4 years old, pressed against his chest as he shielded her with his body. 3 bullets had already hit him. Sloane dropped to her knees beside them. Pain flashed through her leg. She ignored it. "Whitmore," she said calmly. His eyes opened. "I got her," he whispered. "I know you did." She lifted the child from his arms and pointed toward a nearby gate. "Run!" The girl disappeared in seconds. Sloane turned back to the Marine, bleeding out beneath her hands. She packed gauze into the abdominal wound. Tourniquet on the leg. IV line in his arm. Every movement precise. Every second counted. Another round hit her. Then another. Fragments tore into her arm and side. She registered each impact like a distant sound. Pain existed, but it had no authority. "Stay with me," she told Whitmore quietly. His pulse raced under her fingers. Shock creeping closer. So she talked. About the girl in the photo, tucked inside his armor. Jess. She described the restaurant he planned to take her to when he got home. Small things. Normal things. Hope. Because hope slowed panic. And panic killed faster than blood loss. The firefight raged around them. Minutes stretched into something endless. 18 minutes later, the relief force arrived. By then Sloane Carter was kneeling in the street with blood covering most of her uniform. Not all of it hers. A medic ran toward her. He stopped abruptly. "Ma'am, you've been hit." She looked down. Shoulder. Arm. Side. Thigh. 5 wounds she knew about. Maybe more she hadn't felt yet. "Take him first," she said. Whitmore was lifted onto a stretcher. Alive. Barely. But alive. Only then did Sloane let herself sit against the wall behind her. Her father's Timex watch still ticked on her wrist. 9:22 a.m. The morning wasn't finished with her yet. And neither, it seemed, was Fallujah. Because somewhere in the city, someone had planned that ambush with terrifying precision. And Sloane Carter had just survived the opening move of a much larger game. Why did the enemy sniper hesitate when he had the perfect shot? The man watching from the rooftop had Sloane Carter perfectly centered in his scope. She was kneeling in the open street. No cover. No armor strong enough to stop a clean shot at that distance. Yet he lowered his rifle. The order had been clear. Not the medic. Hope was a weapon. Let the medic live long enough to try. Long enough to fail. The architect of the ambush understood psychology as well as warfare. Break a unit's faith in survival. And you broke the unit itself. But something about Sloane Carter disrupted that plan. She didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She worked. Even after the bullets hit her. Even when the street turned into chaos. From the rooftop, the sniper watched something unexpected unfold. The medic refused to break. And that small act of defiance planted a seed of frustration that would echo days later inside a dim interrogation room. Because the architect would remember her. Very clearly. But Sloane knew none of that. 2 hours later, she lay on a surgical table inside a canvas hospital. The surgeon counted the wounds. 5. She frowned slightly. "I counted 4. Fragment here," he said, pointing to her side. "You missed one." She nodded. "I was busy." None of the wounds were fatal. Luck. Or stubborn biology. One fragment remained lodged in her thigh. Too risky to remove. It would stay there the rest of her life. "Light duty," the surgeon said. 2 weeks. 10 days, Sloane replied. He stared at her. Then sighed. 10 days if it heals clean. She slept 11 hours after that, the longest sleep she'd had in months. When she woke, the war was already moving again. Whitmore had survived surgery in Baghdad. Critical but stable. The phrase carried cautious hope. Warren Fitch had not survived the street. His belongings arrived in a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to his daughters. And another note. 7 words written carefully. Carter will know what to say, trust her. Sloane read it twice, then folded it into her pocket. She would write to his wife. She owed him that much. But late that evening, another message arrived. From Dayton, Ohio. Her father's doctor. Frank Carter's cancer had begun moving again. 14 months stable. Now suddenly worsening. Sloane stood inside the medical tent, with the phone still in her hand. The war felt very far away for a moment, and very close at the same time. Her father had once told her something she never forgot. You don't choose when the hard days arrive. You only choose what you do inside them. She rested her hand on the Timex watch he'd given her. Still ticking. Still steady. Outside the tent, Sergeant Amos Carrion arrived quietly with a cup of coffee. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat nearby. Sometimes the strongest form of support was silence. After a while she said softly, "My father's sick." Carrion nodded once. "He raised you well." 4 words, but they carried the weight of understanding. Because the kind of strength Sloane Carter showed on that street did not appear by accident. It was built, over years, by someone who believed competence was the purest form of courage. 3 days later, a new officer arrived at the base. Lieutenant Commander Hollis Crane. Intelligence. He brought a file. And a name. The architect, he said. The strategist behind 14 coordinated attacks in the region, including the ambush that killed Warren Fitch. Crane tapped the file. "We found him." Then he looked directly at Sloane. "And I want you on the team that brings him in." The room went quiet. Sloane glanced at the scars still healing across her arm, at the watch ticking on her wrist, at the memory of a Marine shielding a child with his body. And she said only one thing. "When do we leave?" Because sometimes healing doesn't come from stepping away from the battlefield. Sometimes it comes from walking straight back into it and finishing the work that began there. What kind of man studies an ambush like a puzzle instead of a battle? Sloane Carter found herself wondering that as Lieutenant Commander Crane slid the thin folder across the table toward her. The base generator hummed somewhere outside the tent. A helicopter passed overhead, shaking the canvas walls for a moment before the sound faded into the desert night. Inside the folder were photographs, satellite images, grainy surveillance stills, thermal outlines of buildings in the darkness. At the center of them all was one man. Lean face, quiet eyes, no expression. "This is the architect," Crane said. Sloane studied the image. There was something unsettling about the man's stillness, not arrogance, not anger. "Calculation." "How many attacks?" she asked. 14 in 7 months, Crane replied. The number hung in the air for a moment. 14. Sloane felt the strange coincidence brush across her thoughts. 14 attacks. October 14th. 14 bullets that had torn through her body in that street, though the surgeons still argued over the exact count. Numbers had a way of following people in war. She pushed the thought aside. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Medical support," Crane said, "and perspective." She raised an eyebrow. "Perspective." "You were inside his operation," Crane said calmly. "Before the first shot was fired, you noticed something was wrong." Sloane leaned back slightly. That's not intelligence work, she said. That's just paying attention. Crane didn't smile. That's rarer than you think. He tapped one of the photographs. The compound is 4 kilometers outside the city. Thermal imaging shows rotating guards and intermittent radio activity. We believe he's coordinating another operation. Soon, she asked. Very. Silence settled between them. Finally, she said, when? Friday, 0200. 2 days. Sloan nodded once. I'll be ready. Crane closed the folder. The meeting was over. But Sloan didn't stand immediately. Her thigh ached faintly where the bullet fragment remained, a small reminder inside her body that the street in Fallujah had not been imagined. 5 wounds. None fatal. Some people called that luck. She wasn't sure she believed in luck anymore. Outside the tent, the desert night was warm and quiet. The base had entered that strange twilight period between missions when soldiers moved slower, spoke softer, as if the war itself was catching its breath. Sergeant Amos Carrion stood leaning against a supply crate, drinking coffee. He looked up when she stepped out. You're walking better, he observed. Doctor says 10 days. Carrion nodded slowly. Doctors say a lot of things. She leaned beside him, both of them facing the dark edge of the base. I'm going out again Friday, she said. I figured. You're not surprised. Carrion sipped his coffee. People who are built like you don't sit still long. She considered that. Built like me. He gestured slightly toward the medical tent behind them. You ran 50 meters through an ambush with bullets already in your body, he said quietly. That's not normal behavior. Sloan looked down at her hands. They were still alive, she said simply. Carrion studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. Yes, he said, they were. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Sometimes silence carried more respect than conversation. Later that night, Sloan sat at a small metal desk inside the recovery tent. In front of her lay a blank sheet of paper. Warren Fitch's letter sat beside it. She had read the 7 words again earlier. Carter will know what to say. Trust her. She wasn't sure why he had believed that. They had only spoken a handful of times. But war did strange things to trust. It compressed time, turned weeks into years of understanding. She picked up a pen and began writing to his wife. She wrote about the yellow door drawing he had shown her, about the way his face had changed when he talked about his daughters, about the calm professionalism he carried on every patrol. She chose her words carefully. Not softer than the truth, not harsher than necessary. Somewhere in Ohio, a woman would read this letter and try to understand the last moments of a man she loved. Sloan owed her honesty. But there was one thing she did not write. She did not write about the 2 seconds in the street when she chose Caleb Whitmore instead of Warren Fitch. That decision belonged to her alone. War forced people to make calculations no human heart was designed to carry. When the letter was finished, she folded it slowly. Outside, the base loudspeaker crackled with a routine announcement. Another patrol returning. Another rotation beginning. The war continued its endless rhythm. Sloan reached into her breast pocket and pulled out the envelope she had carried for months. Her father's letter. Frank Carter had given it to her the morning she left home. Read it when you really need it, he had said. Until now she had kept it sealed. Somehow opening it felt like admitting something. Like acknowledging the world had grown heavier than she could carry alone. Her phone vibrated suddenly on the desk. She looked down. Incoming secure call. Dayton, Ohio. Her chest tightened slightly as she answered. Dr. Walsh. The voice on the other end spoke carefully, professionally. The cancer had progressed. Fluid in the lungs. Complications. Words that sounded clinical, but carried the weight of something irreversible. Sloane asked 3 questions. Precise, direct. The way doctors spoke when emotions had to wait. Then she thanked him and ended the call. For a long moment she simply sat there. The tent hummed softly with generator power. Her medical pack rested against the wall beside her, exactly organized as always. Every instrument in its place. Everything ready. Except the one thing she could not prepare for. Losing the man who had taught her how to do all of this. Finally she reached out and lifted the sealed letter again. Her thumb rested on the edge. But after a moment, she slid it back into her pocket unopened. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Footsteps approached the tent entrance. Carrion again. He held 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her without a word. She took it. My father's getting worse, she said quietly. Carrion nodded. He gave you that watch. She glanced at the Timex on her wrist. Yes. He gave you more than that. Sloane looked at him. Carrion met her eyes briefly. He gave you the discipline that keeps people alive. The words settled slowly in her mind. Outside the tent, the desert wind shifted. Friday was coming. And somewhere beyond the city walls, the man who designed the ambush in Fallujah was waiting inside a compound surrounded by guards. The architect. Sloane didn't know yet that he remembered her. Didn't know that he had watched her run through that storm of bullets. Didn't know he had given a specific order that day. Do not shoot the medic. Because hope was a weapon. But the architect had miscalculated something important. Hope didn't always break people. Sometimes it made them impossible to stop. And on Friday morning, before the sun rose over Iraq, Sloane Carter would walk into the architect's world. Not as a soldier seeking revenge. Not even as a medic seeking redemption. But as something far more dangerous. A witness who had survived his design. And was now about to meet the man who built it. Why did the desert feel heavier that night? As if the ground itself knew something important was about to happen. Sloane Carter felt it the moment the vehicles rolled past the outer wire. The city of Fallujah disappeared slowly behind them, its scattered lights fading into the flat darkness of the Iraqi countryside. The convoy moved without headlights, guided only by night vision optics and drivers who had learned the terrain through repetition and memory. Inside the third vehicle, Sloane sat between 2 SEAL operators who had introduced themselves only once. Neither spoke now. That silence wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. This team worked inside a discipline where conversation had no real purpose before a mission. Everyone already understood their role. Words could only complicate focus. Sloane adjusted the strap of her medical pack across her chest. The familiar weight settled against her spine. 42 pounds. It had become part of her body over the past 6 months. Across from her, Lieutenant Commander Crane sat forward slightly, studying a small digital map glowing faint green inside the vehicle. Every few minutes he glanced up through the windshield, measuring distance in the quiet way of someone who had rehearsed the plan many times already. No one looked nervous, but Sloane could feel the quiet tension beneath the stillness. It lived in small details. A gloved hand tapping once against a rifle grip. A shoulder shifting to loosen muscle tension. Controlled breathing. Professionals preparing their bodies for violence they hoped wouldn't be necessary. She checked her watch. 1:57 a.m. 3 minutes to the timeline. Her father had once told her that the most dangerous moment in any operation wasn't the firefight. It was the waiting. Because the mind filled empty space with imagination. And imagination could make even the strongest hands tremble. But Sloane had learned how to quiet that voice. She focused on inventory instead. Tourniquets, IV kits, hemostatic gauze, airway tubes, morphine. Every item had a place. Every place had a reason. The vehicle slowed. Crane raised a closed fist. The convoy stopped instantly. Engines cut. The sudden silence of the desert pressed in around them. 600 meters, Crane said quietly. The rear doors opened. Cold air slipped inside the vehicle. The team dismounted without a sound. Boots touched sand. Gear shifted softly. Weapons came up. The compound lay ahead, barely visible against the night sky. A low wall, 3 structures inside, a faint guard light near the gate. From this distance, it looked unremarkable. That was the point. Places that mattered rarely looked important from the outside. Sloane followed behind the operators as they moved across open ground. Their pace was steady, controlled. No wasted movement. The men ahead of her seemed almost to disappear into the darkness, blending with it. She matched their rhythm. Step. Pause. Step. Her breathing stayed even. Her injured thigh pulsed faintly under the bandage, but the pain remained manageable. Pain was information, not an instruction. At 2:31, they reached the outer wall. 3 operators moved into position. Charges were set with calm efficiency. Crane glanced at his watch, then nodded once. The night shattered. The explosions were small but precise, punching 3 clean openings in the compound wall. The team flowed through them instantly. Inside, the mission moved with startling speed. Doors were breached. Commands shouted in Arabic. Short bursts of suppressed gunfire echoed through the buildings. Sloane stayed near the courtyard wall, where Crane had directed her. She opened her pack. Her hands moved automatically. Preparation. Because if something went wrong, the first 30 seconds would decide who lived. The first operator stumbled out of the second building less than a minute later. Even before he spoke, Sloane saw the injury. The slight lean to his right side. The guarded movement of his left leg. He was bleeding. She moved toward him immediately. He sat where she directed without argument. The wound was a deep fragment cut across the outer thigh. Close. Too close to the femoral artery. But not touching it. Lucky. Or perhaps just 1 inch away from catastrophe. Femoral's clear, he said calmly. I checked. Good, Sloane replied. She packed gauze into the wound and applied pressure. What's your name? She asked. Rutherford. All right, Rutherford, she said quietly. You're walking out of here tonight. He watched her hands while she worked. You always this calm. She tightened the dressing. Only when people are bleeding. He almost smiled. She inserted an IV line quickly. Hold this, she said, pressing gauze into his hands. Both hands don't move. He obeyed immediately. Somewhere inside the third, building the sound of movement shifted. Not combat. Control. The target had been located. The architect. Sloane secured Rutherford's bandage and stood. I'll be back in 4 minutes, she said. She picked up her pack and walked toward the final building. Crane stood in the doorway. He stepped aside as she approached. Inside the room, 3 men lay face down on the floor under guard. A 4th sat upright in a wooden chair. 2 operators stood behind him. Even before anyone spoke, Sloane knew this was him. The architect. He looked younger than she expected. 40, maybe a little older. Lean, alert eyes. Not afraid. Just studying the room the way a chess player studied a board. Blood soaked through his sleeve. A gunshot wound to the upper arm. Another cut along his ribs. Painful but survivable. A field medical kit lay unopened on the floor. Crane gestured toward it. Keep him alive. Sloane crouched beside the man and opened the kit. Her movements were the same ones she had used on Marines 100 times before. Injury was injury. The body didn't care who someone was. She cut away the sleeve. The bullet had shattered part of the humerus. Painful, but manageable with proper splinting. As she prepared the splint, the man spoke. His English was clear. Educated. You were the medic in the street, he said. She didn't respond. Her hands kept working. October 14th, he continued, you ran across open ground. A pause. I watched you through a scope. Sloane wrapped the splint firmly along his arm. Still silent. I gave the order not to shoot you, he said. Her hands paused for half a second. Then continued. Not out of mercy, the man added calmly. A dead medic removes hope too quickly. The room felt colder suddenly. A living medic gives hope, he said, long enough to watch it fail. Sloane secured the splint with final tape. He studied her face carefully. I expected you to break when the others died, he said. But you did not. She finished dressing the rib wound with 3 quick sutures. Minimal work. Just enough to stabilize him for transport. Finally, she looked directly into his eyes. For 2 seconds. No anger. No fear. Just the quiet evaluation of a medic confirming a patient would survive the ride. Then she stood. You're stable, she said simply. The man stared at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had changed shape. You are unusual, he said quietly. But Sloane had already turned away. Outside in the courtyard, the night was beginning to lighten slightly toward gray. The mission was finished. Rutherford still sat exactly where she had left him. He looked up as she approached. 4 minutes, he said. I said 4 minutes, she replied. She checked the bandage. No major bleeding. Good. He stood carefully. Thanks, Doc. Nearby, the operators were loading the captured men into vehicles. Crane approached Sloane beside the truck. For a moment, both of them looked back at the compound. A silent acknowledgement that something important had ended there. Crane extended his hand. She shook it. He held the grip for a moment, longer than expected. Your father built something rare, he said quietly. You proved it tonight. Sloane didn't answer. She simply climbed into the vehicle. The convoy began moving back toward the city. Inside the truck, she placed her father's watch on her knee. 3:18 a.m. Behind them, the compound disappeared into the darkness. But the architect's words lingered in her mind. Hope was a weapon. Maybe he was right. But he had misunderstood one thing. Hope didn't weaken people like Sloane Carter. It gave them a reason to keep moving forward. Even when the world tried to stop them. Even when the bullets kept coming. Even when the cost of doing the right thing never truly disappeared. Why did victory feel strangely quiet when the mission was finally over? The convoy rolled back through the outer gates of the base just before sunrise. The sky above Fallujah was turning a pale gray, the kind of color that made every building and blast wall look flat and tired. Inside the vehicle, Sloane Carter felt the slow return of exhaustion settling into her muscles. The kind that came only after adrenaline finished its work. Across from her, Rutherford leaned back carefully against the metal wall of the truck, one hand pressed lightly against the fresh bandage on his thigh. The bleeding had stopped. His breathing was steady. He caught Sloane watching the wound, Still attached, he said quietly. For now, she replied. A faint grin flickered across his face before he closed his eyes again. The convoy passed the final checkpoint and rolled toward the medical area. Engines cut, doors opened. Men stepped out, stretching stiff legs and shoulders. The mission had lasted less than 2 hours, but it carried the weight of weeks. Inside the holding vehicle, the architect was transferred into military custody. His broken arm was secured in the splint Sloan had placed on it. His face remained calm, almost curious, as if he were still studying something he hadn't fully understood. Sloan didn't watch him go. Her attention had already moved back to the living. Rutherford was helped down from the truck. She walked beside him toward the medical tent. "You kept your promise," he said as they reached the entrance. "What promise?" "You said I'd walk out." She shrugged slightly. "I try not to lie to patients." Inside the tent, the duty medic took over. Sloan gave a quick summary of the injury, the treatment, the IV fluids. Everything precise, efficient. Once Rutherford was settled on a cot, she finally stepped back. Only then did she notice the ache spreading through her own body. The wounds from the ambush still hadn't fully healed. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. The fragment in her thigh pulsed faintly. She leaned briefly against the edge of a supply table. Fatigue tried to pull her down, but paperwork still waited. Debriefs, medical logs, operational reports. War had its own bureaucracy, and every action had to be recorded. 3 hours later, she sat inside a small operations room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. Lieutenant Commander Crane finished reviewing the final debrief notes. "The network's finished," he said. Sloan looked up. "Finished?" "Without the architect coordinating them, the other cells collapse," he explained. "We've already intercepted communications showing confusion, no leadership structure." He closed the folder. That ambush on October 14th was their largest operation. The words hung in the air. Largest operation. Sloan thought about Warren Fitch, about the yellow door his daughter had drawn. Victory felt strange when measured against memories like that. Crane watched her expression carefully. "You did well tonight," he said. She nodded once but didn't respond. Compliments didn't change the arithmetic of war. Some people survived. Some didn't. No speech could rebalance that equation. Later that afternoon, Sloan finally returned to the recovery tent. The base had fully awakened by then. Helicopters thundered overhead. Trucks rumbled through the gravel roads between buildings. Radios crackled with routine reports. War continuing. She lay down on the narrow cot and closed her eyes. Sleep came quickly, but the dream arrived even faster. She was back in Dayton, standing in the driveway outside her childhood home. Her father stood near the garage, hands in his pockets, watching her load bags into a car. The same morning she had left for deployment. He wasn't speaking. He rarely did when the moment mattered most. But she remembered the look in his eyes. Pride mixed with worry. The quiet understanding that once she drove away, life would never be exactly the same again. Sloan woke suddenly. The tent was dim with late afternoon light. For a moment she simply lay there, letting the dream settle into memory. Then she reached into her breast pocket. The sealed envelope was still there. Her father's letter. She turned it slowly between her fingers. For months she had carried it unopened, saving it for the day she truly needed it. The day when the weight became too much. She exhaled slowly. Maybe that day had finally arrived. Carefully she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her father's handwriting was steady and deliberate. She read the letter once, Then again. By the time she finished, the room had grown completely quiet. Outside, the base continued its constant movement. But inside the tent, time felt suspended. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. There was only one sentence she carried away from it. One line she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Her phone vibrated suddenly on the small table beside the cot. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Baghdad Military Hospital. Her chest tightened slightly as she answered. Carter. There was a pause. Then a familiar voice. Doc. For a moment she didn't breathe. Whitmore. Yeah, Caleb Whitmore said weakly, still breathing. Relief moved through her chest like a slow tide. How are you feeling? Like I got run over by a truck, he said, but the doctors say I'm hard to kill. That's accurate. He was quiet for a second. Doc, they told me what you did. Sloane leaned back against the cot. You did the hard part, she said. You shielded that kid. I barely remember it. You don't have to, she replied softly. The important part is that she's alive. Another pause. Then Whitmore said something she didn't expect. Jess came to the hospital. Sloane smiled faintly. I thought she might. I showed her the picture she gave me, he said, the one behind my armor plate. How'd she react? She cried, he admitted quietly. Then she told me I'm an idiot. That sounds like love. He laughed weakly. Doc, thank you. Sloane looked down at her hands. 5 scars healing slowly across her skin. You don't thank the medic, she said. Why not? Because saving you wasn't a favor, she replied. It was the job. Whitmore was quiet again. Finally he said softly, still, I'm glad it was you. After the call ended, Sloane sat alone for a while. The sun had begun setting outside the tent. The sky turned deep orange over the desert. She reached into her pocket again and touched her father's letter. The sentence from it echoed quietly in her mind. A sentence about responsibility. About doing the work in front of you, no matter how hard it becomes. That night Sloane walked through the base one last time before returning to her cot. In a few days she would leave Fallujah. Return home. But part of her would always remain here. In the streets. In the memories. In the lives that continued, because she had been present in the moment when everything nearly ended. War rarely gave people clean endings. But sometimes it gave something else. A quiet understanding. That dignity didn't come from medals or recognition. It came from the small decisions made when nobody was watching. The decision to keep moving. The decision to keep helping. Even when the cost stayed with you forever. And Sloane Carter had made those decisions again and again in a place where hope was fragile. But never completely gone. Why did leaving the battlefield feel harder than surviving it? Sloane Carter didn't expect that part. War had a strange gravity, not the kind that held you down, the kind that followed you when you tried to leave. 12 days after the compound raid, she stood near the edge of the forward operating base with her medical pack resting beside her boots. The morning sky above Fallujah was gray with dust and aviation fuel. A transport aircraft idled on the runway, its engines producing the deep mechanical hum that meant departure was close. She checked her watch. Her father's old Timex still ticked steadily against her wrist. The same quiet rhythm it had kept the morning she first stepped into Iraq. 6 months ago. It felt both longer and shorter than that. Behind her the base moved through its usual routine, trucks rolling past, Marines crossing the yard, helicopters lifting slowly into the sky. War did not pause when people left it. It simply replaced them. Sloane adjusted the strap of her pack and watched the aircraft. Inside her pocket rested three small things she carried everywhere now. The letter from her father, the note from Warren Fitch, and the card Amos Carrion had handed her before the last mission. The one with the name and phone number written across it. For the next ones, the words meant more now than they had the day he gave them. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn to recognize the pace. Corporal Declan Pewitt stopped a few feet away. For a moment he said nothing. That alone told Sloane the conversation mattered. Pewitt wasn't a man who hesitated with words. He cleared his throat once, staring out toward the runway instead of at her. "What I said before that mission," he began slowly. She waited. "About you being just the doc." The wind moved faintly through the base. Pewitt worked his jaw once. "I was wrong." The words came out clean, direct. No excuses. Sloane studied him for a moment. Admitting mistakes was harder for soldiers than charging into gunfire. "You were asking a professional question," she said calmly. "Why a corpsman was walking inside a clearing operation." "Not the way I asked it." "No," she agreed. Silence stretched for a moment. Finally she gave a small nod. "But you adjusted when it mattered." He exhaled quietly. "Yeah." That was enough for both of them. Pewitt stepped back slightly. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he raised two fingers briefly toward his brow. Not quite a salute. More like a quiet acknowledgement between professionals. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Sloane watched him disappear between the rows of vehicles. Respect in war didn't come from speeches. It came from moments like that. A few minutes later, Sergeant Amos Carrion approached from the direction of the barracks. He stopped beside her, hands resting casually in his pockets. "You leaving without saying goodbye to anyone?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I figured that would make things easier." "For who?" "Everyone." Carrion considered that, then shook his head slightly. "That's not how it works." They stood side by side watching the transport crew finish loading equipment into the aircraft. "You going back to Dayton?" he asked. "Yes." "Your father?" She nodded. "He doesn't have much time." Carrion didn't reply immediately. Finally he said quietly, "You'll be glad you went." Sloane looked down at the watch on her wrist. "He's the reason I came here in the first place," she said. Carrion glanced at the Timex. "He taught you how to read people." "And wounds." "And silence," Carrion added. She smiled slightly at that. A pause followed. Then he reached into his pocket and tapped the card she had tucked there earlier. "You ever call that number," he said, "tell her I sent you." Sloane nodded. "I will." "You be good at it." "At what?" "Teaching." She looked out toward the runway again. "I'm just a corpsman." Carrion's expression didn't change. "You told me I was a quart low and made me sit down before a combat mission," he said. "You remember that?" "Yeah." "You didn't argue?" "No." "That's teaching." She considered that quietly. Before she could respond, a voice called across the yard. "Carter." Sloane turned. Lieutenant Commander Crane approached quickly from the operations building. He stopped in front of her. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then Crane extended his hand. She shook it. "Your reports helped close the entire network," he said. "The architect's already being moved for interrogation." Sloane nodded once. "Good." Crane studied her face. "You did more than your job in Fallujah." She didn't respond. He seemed to expect that. After a moment he said quietly, Your father built something rare. The same words he had spoken after the raid. Then he added something new. Whatever you decide to do next, keep building it. With that he turned and walked back toward the operations building. The aircraft crew waved toward Sloane. Boarding time. She lifted her medical pack and walked across the tarmac. Each step felt oddly heavy. Not with regret. With memory. The ramp lowered. She climbed inside and found a seat near a small circular window. The aircraft began to taxi. Outside the base shrank slowly. Blast walls. Barracks. Rows of dusty vehicles. The strange, temporary city that had been her entire world for half a year. She rested her forehead lightly against the cool metal wall. As the plane lifted into the sky, Fallujah spread beneath them. Flat rooftops. Narrow streets. Places where lives had changed forever. Somewhere down, there was the street where Warren Fitch had fallen. Somewhere was the small gate where a little girl had run to safety. And somewhere in a hospital hundreds of miles away, Caleb Whitmore was still alive. Because of decisions made in seconds. Sloane closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the city had already begun to disappear beneath clouds of dust. She placed her hand over the pocket containing her father's letter. "I'm coming home," she whispered softly. It wasn't a promise. It was simply a statement of fact. And for the first time in months, the war felt like something behind her instead of ahead. But Sloane Carter didn't yet know that the work she had done in Fallujah wasn't finished. Because 5 months later, 14 students would sit inside a classroom waiting for someone who had actually been there. Someone who understood what happened when theory met reality. Someone who could teach them how to keep their hands steady when everything around them collapsed. And when that day came, Sloane Carter would stand in front of them. Not as a hero, not as a legend, just as a medic who had learned something simple and powerful in the middle of a firefight. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everyone else together. Why did the number 14 make Sloane Carter pause before she even began speaking? She stood at the front of the classroom at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, Virginia, with both hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and whiteboard markers. 14 students sat in front of her. Different uniforms, different ranks, different branches. But the same expression in their eyes. Focus. The kind of attention people carried when they knew the training might one day decide whether someone lived or died. Sloane had reviewed their files the previous afternoon. All capable, all teachable, all selected because someone believed they could handle the responsibility of battlefield medicine. Still, the number had caught her attention. 14. For a moment, she simply looked at them. Then she set her medical pack on the table. The same pack she had carried through Fallujah. The same one that still held faint stains that no amount of cleaning had completely erased. Beside it, she placed her father's Timex watch. The quiet ticking filled the pause between breaths. None of the students spoke. They were waiting. Sloane felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders. Teaching wasn't the same as combat, but in some ways it was heavier. Because what she said here would follow these people into places she would never see. She thought about the street in Fallujah, about the moment she had knelt beside Caleb Whitmore while bullets tore through the air, about Warren Fitch, about the yellow door his daughter had drawn. Those memories didn't feel like stories. They felt like instructions. Finally she spoke. "When someone is bleeding out in front of you," she said calmly, "there are 3 things that matter." The room remained completely still. Time, pressure, judgment. She picked up a tourniquet from her pack. Time, she continued, holding it up, because most preventable deaths in combat happen inside the first 10 minutes. She tightened the strap around a training mannequin's leg. Pressure, she said, twisting the rod until the simulated bleeding stopped. Then she looked back at the class. And judgment. Her eyes moved slowly across the 14 faces. Because sometimes you'll have 2 patients and only enough time to save one. The room grew quieter somehow. Everyone understood what she meant. War forced decisions no classroom could fully prepare you for. But that didn't mean you stopped teaching. She moved through the lesson methodically. Airway management, hemorrhage control, shock prevention. Her voice remained calm, steady, precise. Exactly the same tone she had used kneeling in the middle of a firefight. After an hour, she paused. Any questions? A young Navy corpsman in the second row raised his hand. Yes. Ma'am, have you ever had to make that choice? The question hung in the air. Every student in the room watched her. Sloane didn't look away. Yes, she said simply. The silence deepened. She didn't tell them the whole story. Not about the bullets. Not about the screaming. Just the part they needed. 2 Marines were hit, she said. One was already gone. The other still had a chance. Her fingers rested briefly on the edge of the table. I chose the one who still had a chance. The young corpsman swallowed slightly. Did he make it? Sloane allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Yes. The tension in the room softened just a little. Then she added quietly, but someone else didn't. The lesson continued after that. Not heavier, just more honest. By late afternoon, the class finally ended. The students packed their notebooks slowly, many of them lingering to thank her before leaving. Eventually, the room emptied. Sloane stood alone beside the table. The quiet felt different from the silence of combat. This one held possibility instead of danger. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. Caleb Whitmore. She answered immediately. Doc, he said, his voice stronger now. How's physical therapy? She asked. Painful, he admitted, but I can walk again. That's progress. There was a brief pause. I wanted to tell you something, he said. I'm listening. I met the little girl. Sloane blinked. The one from the street. Yeah, her family found me through the Red Cross. What happened? Whitmore laughed quietly. She hugged me. Sloane felt warmth spread slowly through her chest. Good, she said softly. Another pause. Doc, she's starting school next year. For a moment, Sloane looked at the 14 empty desks in the classroom. Life continuing. Growing. Moving forward. That's good, she repeated. After the call ended, she sat down slowly in one of the student chairs. Her father's watch still ticked quietly on the table. Frank Carter had passed away 3 weeks earlier. She had been there in Dayton, sitting beside him in the hospital room, holding his hand. Before the end, he had looked at her and said the same thing he had written in the letter she carried all those months. The sentence she had repeated to her students that morning. She picked up the watch and turned it gently between her fingers. Outside the classroom window, the evening sun dipped low across the Virginia sky. Somewhere in the world, another young medic was probably checking someone's pulse before a mission, counting heartbeats, trying to keep people alive in the narrow space between chaos and hope. Sloane stood and picked up her medical pack. She switched off the classroom lights and stepped into the hallway. Her father's sentence echoed quietly in her mind. Not dramatic, not heroic, just true. Do the work in front of you. Do it well, and let the rest take care of itself. because sometimes courage wasn't loud. Sometimes it didn't even look like bravery. Sometimes it looked like a quiet medic kneeling in the street, counting heartbeats while the world fell apart around her. And sometimes dignity didn't speak at all. It simply acted,